Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the American frontier. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard the story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1868, a time when America was still recovering from the wounds of a civil war. In the remote wilderness of northern Montana Territory, nestled between the jagged peaks of what would later become Glacier National Park, stood a modest cabin belonging to the Oatman family. The nearest settlement, Fort Benton, was over 30 miles away through treacherous mountain passes, a journey that took nearly 2 days on horseback in favorable weather. In winter, the cabin was completely isolated, cut off from civilization by walls of snow and bitter cold that could freeze a man solid in hours. The Oatman family, Thomas, a stern former Union soldier, his wife Eleanor, and their daughter Sarah, then 19, had moved west from Pennsylvania in 1866, seeking a fresh start away from the devastation of war. Thomas had ambitions of establishing a trading post to serve trappers and the occasional prospector who ventured into these untamed lands. The cabin they constructed was sturdy but basic, 2 rooms with thick log walls, small windows with shutters that could be barred from the inside, and a stone fireplace that struggled to ward off the brutal Montana winters. By all accounts, the Oatmans were unremarkable pioneers, similar to thousands of others who pushed westward during this period. What made them different, what made their story worthy of documentation, was what reportedly occurred during the winter of 1868, and the peculiar aftermath that would confound authorities for decades. According to official records from Fort Benton's territorial administration, Thomas Oatman arrived at the fort alone on February 18, 1868, in a state of extreme agitation. He reported that unknown assailants had attacked his homestead 3 nights prior. In his account, recorded by Lieutenant James Whitaker, Thomas claimed that his wife Eleanor had been killed in the attack, while he had narrowly escaped into the woods. Most disturbing was his claim that his daughter Sarah had been taken by the attackers. Lieutenant Whitaker's personal journal, discovered decades later in a trunk belonging to his grandson, provides additional context not included in the official report. Oatman arrived shortly before dawn, Whitaker wrote, his clothing torn and soiled, yet bearing no injuries consistent with the violent struggle he described. His eyes held a peculiar vacancy I have observed only in men who have witnessed the most horrific battlefield carnage. Yet there was something else, a furtiveness that suggested he was withholding critical information. When questioned directly about the nature of his attackers, he became evasive, alternating between claiming they were renegade trappers and suggesting they were deserters from the Confederate Army, despite the war's end 3 years prior. The lieutenant, a veteran of both military campaigns and frontier conflicts, noted his suspicions but ordered an immediate response nonetheless. Whether Oatman's account is entirely truthful or not, he continued, the possibility that his daughter remains alive and in danger necessitates swift action. I have selected men with experience in tracking and wilderness survival, along with guides familiar with the territory. A rescue party was organized immediately, consisting of 6 soldiers and 3 local guides familiar with the territory. The party departed the following morning, pushing through deep snow and deteriorating weather conditions. According to Lieutenant Whitaker's journal, they reached the Oatman cabin on February 21st, finding it in a state of peculiar disarray, though not consistent with the violent struggle described by Mr. Oatman. Private Samuel Monroe, the youngest member of the rescue party, maintained a personal diary that provides the most detailed account of what they discovered. The cabin stood silent in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, he wrote. No tracks approached or departed, save our own, as recent snowfall had covered whatever evidence might have existed. Lieutenant Whitaker ordered us to approach with weapons ready, but it became apparent upon closer inspection that the dwelling was abandoned. Monroe described the cabin's interior in meticulous detail. The main room contained a table with 3 wooden chairs, one overturned, and the remnants of a meal abandoned mid-preparation. A pot of stew had boiled dry on the iron stove, suggesting a hasty departure. The fireplace contained only cold ash, with no attempts to rekindle it despite the freezing temperatures. A small shelf held 3 books, a Bible, a manual on frontier medicine, and a volume of Shakespeare's tragedies, the latter open to Macbeth, with certain passages underlined in ink. The rescue party documented several troubling inconsistencies. Though Thomas had reported his wife murdered, no body was found in or around the property. There were no signs of forced entry, and the cabin's interior showed evidence of a hasty departure rather than violence. The fireplace contained cold ashes at least several days old, suggesting the cabin had been abandoned before the date Thomas claimed the attack occurred. Most peculiar were the discoveries made by Private Monroe, who noted that the cabin's root cellar had been recently emptied, and a single horse was missing from the small stable, along with a saddle and provisions sufficient for several days' journey. This contradicted Thomas's claim that the attackers had stolen all their horses and supplies. Another expedition member, Sergeant William Blackwood, recorded his observations of what appeared to be a small workshop adjacent to the main cabin. The room contained a crude wooden table, bearing unusual tools, small chisels, magnifying glasses of various strengths, and what appeared to be surveying instruments, he wrote in his official report. Most notably, the table's surface was covered with fine rock dust, as if specimens had been examined or worked upon recently. A lockbox that might have contained these specimens was present but empty, its lock broken not by force but by its key, which remained inserted. When the rescue party extended their search to the surrounding area, they discovered a series of regular trips had been made between the cabin and a ridge approximately 3 miles distant. Despite the recent snowfall, the path had been traveled so frequently that depressions remained visible. Following this trail led them to what appeared to be the collapsed entrance of an old mine shaft. The mine entrance has been deliberately sealed, Lieutenant Whitaker noted. Recent tool marks suggest this was done within the past few weeks, with considerable effort expended to conceal the opening. Without proper equipment, and in light of our primary mission to locate the missing women, I have elected not to attempt clearing the obstruction. Upon their return to Fort Benton with this information, Thomas Oatman was confronted with the discrepancies between his account and the evidence observed. According to Lieutenant Whitaker's report to his superiors, Mr. Oatman's manner transformed from one of desperate concern to guarded hostility when questioned about the mine shaft and the absent lockbox. When presented with the fact that we found no body nor evidence of violence beyond a general disarray consistent with hasty packing, he became increasingly agitated. Thomas's subsequent statement, recorded by the fort's administrative clerk and preserved in territorial records, offered a modified account. I may have been confused about certain details, he admitted. The attack occurred during the night, and in the darkness and confusion, I cannot be certain of everything I witnessed. It is possible that Eleanor was taken rather than killed outright. The important fact remains that my family is missing, and I require assistance in locating them. When pressed specifically about the mine shaft, Thomas became notably evasive. I know nothing of any mine, he claimed. If such a place exists near our property, it was unknown to me. This statement contradicted evidence from his own neighbors in Pennsylvania, who later testified that Thomas had specifically mentioned old mining operations as one of his reasons for selecting that particular parcel of land, believing there might be overlooked mineral deposits worth claiming. The search for Sarah Oatman and Eleanor continued through the spring, but yielded no results. By April 1868, the official search was abandoned, though notices were circulated to settlements throughout the territory. Thomas Oatman departed Fort Benton in late March, stating his intention to continue searching for his family independently. According to port records in Seattle, Washington Territory, a man matching Thomas Oatman's description booked passage on a vessel bound for San Francisco in May of that year. After this, the historical record falls silent on his whereabouts for nearly a decade. One curious detail emerged years later when Howard Jenkins, the proprietor of the general store in Fort Benton, was interviewed about the case. Jenkins recalled that Thomas purchased several items before his departure: a sturdy leather satchel with reinforced corners, 3 small wooden boxes with brass fittings, and an unusual amount of cotton batting typically used for quilting. When asked the purpose of these items, Thomas reportedly replied they were for securing fragile specimens during travel. Jenkins thought little of it at the time, assuming Thomas meant botanical samples or similar frontier curiosities. The Oatman case might have remained merely another frontier tragedy, one of the countless disappearances that characterized the perilous westward expansion, if not for an unexpected discovery made in 1877, when a land surveyor named Edwin Harlow stumbled upon a small leather-bound journal while mapping areas along the Canadian border, approximately 15 miles north of the former Oatman cabin. Harlow's official survey report, filed with the Department of the Interior and later archived in the National Archives, describes the discovery. While establishing sight lines through a densely wooded ravine, I observed what appeared to be the remains of a temporary shelter, little more than a lean-to constructed of fallen branches against a rock face, long abandoned. Beneath a stone that may have been used to secure belongings against animal intrusion, I discovered a small leather-bound volume, its pages water-damaged but partially legible. The journal, bearing the inscription "Property of Sarah Oatman" on its inside cover, was turned over to authorities in Helena. What followed was a re-examination of a case long considered closed, and the beginning of a much darker narrative than had initially been suspected. The journal contained entries dating from June 1867 through February 1868. The earlier entries described the mundane challenges of frontier life: food preservation, weather conditions, and occasional visits from trappers or indigenous people from nearby territories. Sarah's writing was practical and observant, with occasional flashes of dry humor about their isolation. "Father says we are pioneers," she wrote in one entry from August 1867, "but pioneers usually have neighbors somewhere. We have only trees, mountains, and Father's increasingly dark moods." These references to Thomas Oatman's moods became more frequent and detailed as winter approached. In November, Sarah wrote, "Father rarely speaks now except to issue commands. Mother weeps silently when she thinks no one observes her. The snow has begun, and with it, I fear we are truly trapped, not by nature, but by Father's strange obsession." An entry from November 23rd, partially damaged by water but reconstructed by archivists, provides additional context. "Father returned from the old mine again today, more agitated than usual. He spent hours at his table, examining what he calls his discoveries. Mother attempted to show interest, hoping to improve his temperament, but he accused her of wanting to steal his findings. 'No one must know,' he kept saying, 'not until I understand what they mean.' He becomes someone unrecognizable when discussing these matters, a stranger wearing my father's face. The nature of this obsession was never explicitly stated in the surviving pages, but several entries alluded to Thomas spending long hours in the woods, returning with treasures that he kept locked in a wooden chest. Sarah's entry from December 24, 1867 reads, "Father forbids us from approaching his collection. Yesterday, Mother attempted to clean near the chest while he was out checking traps. When he returned, I have never heard such fury in a human voice. Mother's eye is swollen shut. He claims she fell while sweeping. We both know different." A particularly disturbing entry from January 9, 1868, suggests escalating paranoia in Thomas's behavior. "Father has begun speaking of visitors in the night. He insists they circle the cabin when we sleep, studying us through the cracks between logs. Mother believes the isolation has affected his mind, but I am no longer certain. Last night I woke to find him seated at the table, his rifle across his lap, staring at the window without blinking for what must have been hours. When I asked what he was watching for, he replied, "They're curious about what I took from them. They want it back." The final legible entries from early February 1868 suggest escalating tensions within the cabin. "The arguments at night have grown worse," Sarah wrote on February 10th. "Mother says we must leave when the pass is clear. Father says no one is leaving. I hear him at night pacing, muttering about what he found in the old mine shaft. He keeps the rifle beside him now, even at meals." Her entry from February 12th described a troubling incident. "Father brought a new specimen from the mine today, larger than the others, bearing markings that seemed to distress him greatly. He spent hours examining it under his magnifying glass, making drawings that he immediately burned in the fireplace." When Mother asked innocent questions about his activities, he exploded in rage, accusing us of conspiring against him, of being in communication with them. When I asked who he meant, he stared at me as if seeing a stranger and said, "You know who watches us. You've always known." The last intact entry, dated February 14, 1868, contains only the cryptic line, "Mother says tonight we must go with or without his blessing. She has packed a small bag. I am afraid, but more afraid to stay." When Territorial Marshal Warren Blackwood reviewed the journal in 1877, he ordered a new investigation into the Oatman case. His official correspondence, preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives, reveals his growing concern. The contents of Sarah Oatman's journal suggest a situation far more complex and disturbing than the initial report of an attack by unknown assailants. The document strongly indicates a pattern of escalating paranoia and violence within the household, culminating in a planned escape by the two women. Given this new evidence, I believe we must consider the possibility that Thomas Oatman himself was responsible for his family's disappearance. The cabin site was re-examined, but after 9 years, little evidence remained. However, one significant discovery was made. Approximately 200 yards behind the cabin, partially concealed by forest undergrowth, investigators located a shallow depression in the ground that suggested a hastily filled hole of considerable size. Marshal Blackwood's report describes the excavation. Upon removing approximately 3 feet of soil, we discovered what appears to be human remains in an advanced state of decomposition. The skeleton is incomplete, with several smaller bones apparently carried off by scavengers, but the skull and larger bones remain. Dr. Samuel Fenton, who accompanied our expedition, has identified these as belonging to an adult female, estimated to be between 30 and 40 years of age. According to the examiner's report, the skull showed evidence of significant trauma inconsistent with natural death or animal predation. Specifically, Dr. Fenton noted a depressed fracture to the right parietal region, consistent with a powerful blow from a blunt object. The size and shape of the fracture suggest it may have been caused by the butt end of a rifle or similar implement. Additional evidence recovered from the gravesite included fragments of a woolen dress, a simple gold wedding band inscribed with the initials E.W., matching Eleanor Wilcox, her maiden name, and several hairpins of a style popular in the eastern states during the mid-1860s. These items strongly suggested the remains belonged to Eleanor Oatman. Marshal Blackwood's subsequent investigation traced Thomas Oatman to San Francisco, where city records indicated he had established himself as a moderately successful merchant dealing in frontier curiosities and purported Native American artifacts. The business, operating under the name Oatman's Cabinet of Western Wonders, was located in a modest storefront on Montgomery Street. An advertisement from the San Francisco Chronicle, dated October 1872, described the establishment as offering authentic specimens of geological and anthropological interest from the untamed territories, curated by a gentleman explorer who has ventured where few civilized men dare tread. Several individuals who had visited the shop provided statements to Marshal Blackwood's deputies. Richard Hargrove, a professor of natural history at a local academy, recalled Mr. Oatman's collection contained the expected assortment of arrowheads, pressed flowers, and mineral samples typical of such establishments. However, he maintained a private room at the rear of the shop, access to which was strictly limited to what he termed serious scholars and collectors. When I expressed interest in this exclusive collection, Oatman studied me with unusual intensity before declining, stating that the specimens therein were not yet ready for academic scrutiny. Another visitor, Mrs. Elizabeth Caldwell, described an unsettling encounter. I entered the shop seeking a gift for my husband, who maintains an amateur interest in geology. Mr. Oatman was initially cordial, but when I inquired about a particular stone displayed under glass, an unremarkable-looking rock bearing unusual circular markings, his demeanor changed dramatically. He removed the specimen from view, claiming it had already been purchased, and thereafter treated me with barely concealed hostility until I departed. By the time authorities arrived to question him in late 1877, Thomas had again disappeared, reportedly having sold his business and departed by steamship, possibly bound for Hawaii or points beyond in the Pacific. The new proprietor of the shop, which had been renamed and converted to sell conventional souvenirs, claimed to have no knowledge of Thomas's destination or the nature of the private collection mentioned by previous visitors. The investigation might have ended there, with Thomas Oatman beyond reach, had it not been for a remarkable coincidence reported in the San Francisco Examiner in March of 1878. A woman named Sarah Thurmond had read about the Oatman case in the newspaper and came forward claiming to be Sarah Oatman. Her account, while initially met with skepticism, contained details about the Montana cabin that had never been published. The Examiner article, authored by journalist Edward Michaels, described the woman as a respectable young lady of about 30 years, modestly dressed and composed in her bearing, yet conveying an underlying tension in her manner when discussing her former life. Her eyes, clear and direct in most conversation, become distant when addressing certain aspects of her experience, as if viewing scenes too painful to fully revisit. According to formal statements given to Marshall Blackwood, who traveled to San Francisco to interview her, Sarah claimed that on the night of February 14, 1868, her mother Eleanor had indeed planned their escape from what had become an increasingly dangerous situation. Thomas, she alleged, had discovered them preparing to leave, resulting in a violent confrontation, during which he struck Eleanor with the butt of his rifle. Sarah's testimony, preserved in court documents, described how her mother fell against the stone hearth, suffering a fatal head wound. He seemed more shocked than remorseful, Sarah's statement reads. He kept saying, "Now no one can leave. No one must know what's in these mountains. I feared I would share Mother's fate, so when he went to dig a grave behind the cabin, I took our remaining horse and fled north toward the Canadian border, as Mother had planned." Sarah provided additional details not recorded in her journal. Father insisted that his discoveries would revolutionize our understanding of American prehistory, though he never explained precisely what he meant. In his more lucid moments, he spoke of artifacts that predated any known civilization and proof that would upset established science. These claims became interwoven with increasing paranoia about being watched and followed. He began to attribute consciousness and intention to the specimens themselves, claiming they communicated with him when he studied them in solitude. Sarah's account explained that she had survived by finding shelter with a Blackfoot family who took pity on her. She remained with them for nearly a year before making her way to a mission in present-day Alberta. Eventually, she worked as a domestic servant, saving enough money to reach San Francisco by 1872. There, fearing her father might still be searching for her, she adopted the surname Thurmond and established a new life. When asked why Thomas would fabricate a story about an attack on the cabin, Sarah offered a troubling explanation. According to her testimony, her father had become obsessed with something he had discovered in an abandoned mine shaft near their homestead in late 1867. She described him bringing back strange rocks with peculiar markings that he would study by candlelight, becoming increasingly paranoid and convinced of their value. He believed he had discovered something that would make him wealthy beyond measure, Sarah stated. Not gold, but something he claimed was older than the mountains themselves. Mother thought his mind was fracturing from isolation. I began to believe the same. One detail Sarah provided that particularly interested investigators was her description of the specimens themselves. They were not especially remarkable in appearance at first glance, she stated. Most were dark gray or greenish stone, roughly the size of a man's palm. What distinguished them were the markings, perfect circles arranged in patterns that Father insisted could not occur naturally. Some contained what appeared to be impressions of creatures unlike any I had seen, not quite shells, not quite insects, with symmetrical structures Father claimed were too regular to be the work of nature alone. Marshal Blackwood's investigation corroborated parts of Sarah's account. Land surveys confirmed the existence of an abandoned mine shaft approximately 3 miles from the Oatman cabin, though by 1878 it had collapsed and could not be explored. Several items recovered from Thomas Oatman's San Francisco shop and cataloged by authorities included unusual geological specimens described as rocks bearing symbols of indeterminate origin, possibly natural formations misinterpreted as artificial. The case took another turn when Dr. Lewis Thornton, a geologist from Berkeley who examined these specimens in 1879, noted in his report that while most were indeed natural formations with coincidental markings, 2 samples contained what appeared to be fossilized impressions that he could not readily identify. His notes, later archived at the University of California, described them as organic in origin, yet conforming to no known pattern in the fossil record. Dr. Thornton's report continues. The symmetry observed in specimen B7 is particularly striking. The impression suggests an organism with radial structure, but with elements arranged in multiples of 7, rather than the 5-fold symmetry common to echinoderms or other known marine invertebrates. Without context regarding the stratum from which it was obtained, precise dating is impossible, though the degree of mineralization suggests considerable antiquity. I hesitate to definitively classify this specimen within established taxonomic categories. Unfortunately, these specimens were lost in the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire, which destroyed the evidence warehouse where they were stored. Photographs taken for Dr. Thornton's analysis were similarly lost, leaving only his written descriptions as record of their characteristics. Sarah Thurman's identity as Sarah Oatman was eventually confirmed through interviews with Pennsylvania acquaintances who had known the family before their westward journey. Several former neighbors from their hometown of Harrisburg provided sworn statements identifying her from current photographs and confirming specific details about the family that would not have been known to an impostor. Martha Wilcox, Eleanor's sister, traveled from Pennsylvania to San Francisco specifically to meet the woman claiming to be her niece. Her letter to Marshal Blackwood afterward states, "I am absolutely convinced this is indeed my sister's daughter. She possesses not only Eleanor's distinctive blue-green eyes and the small scar on her left hand from a childhood accident, but recalls intimate family details no stranger could possibly know." Her account of Thomas's deterioration, while shocking, aligns with concerns I expressed before their departure west. My brother-in-law was always an intensely driven man, prone to fixations on his various business schemes. The isolation of frontier life appears to have exacerbated these tendencies to a tragic degree. Sarah never faced charges related to her father's disappearance, as authorities considered her a victim rather than an accomplice. She remained in San Francisco, where city directories indicate she married a merchant named William Thurmond in 1882 and lived a quiet life until her death in 1921. Thomas Oatman was never located, despite notices circulated throughout the Pacific Territories and as far as Australia and New Zealand. A report from a whaling captain in 1883 claimed that a man matching Thomas's description had been seen in the Marquesas Islands living among the indigenous population, but this account was never verified. The captain's logbook, later donated to the Maritime Museum of San Francisco, contains a brief entry. Encountered American on Nukuhiva who claimed knowledge of ancient artifacts predating human settlement of islands. Man extremely agitated when pressed for details, refused to give name but physical appearance and accent consistent with northeastern United States. Natives report he arrived 2 years prior, bringing small collection of stones he guards obsessively. The most curious epilogue to the Oatman case emerged in 1912, when Professor James Harrington of Stanford University conducted interviews with aging residents of Fort Benton for a historical study of Montana Territory. One interview subject, Eliza Donovan, who had been a young woman working at the fort's general store in 1868, recalled Thomas Oatman's arrival. "What struck me about Mr. Oatman," her statement reads, "was not his agitation, which was pronounced, but rather what he carried. Despite claiming to have fled for his life with nothing but the clothes on his back, he had with him a canvas sack that he guarded jealously. I remember thinking it odd that a man who had supposedly just lost his wife and daughter would be so concerned with a collection of rocks." Harrington's research notes, published in the Journal of Western History in 1914, also referenced an 1881 newspaper article from a Sydney, Australia publication describing an American man who had caused a stir among scientific circles there by presenting what he claimed were artifacts of pre-human civilization discovered in the American Northwest. When he thought no one was looking, I observed him checking its contents, strange rock fragments that he handled with something approaching reverence. The man, who called himself Thomas Oatman, was reportedly dismissed as a fraud, though the article mentioned that several of his specimens were purchased by a private collector before Oatman departed for destinations unknown. The article, from the Sydney Morning Herald, dated June 17, 1881, reported, "The gentleman in question, who speaks with an American accent and gives his name as Thomas Oatman, has presented to the Natural History Society several stone specimens which he claims represent evidence of intelligent life in North America, predating all known native civilizations. While the stones do bear unusual markings, expert opinion suggests these are merely natural formations misinterpreted by an enthusiastic amateur." Mr. Oatman became highly agitated when this assessment was presented, accusing the society of conspiring to suppress revolutionary discoveries. Most curious was his insistence that the stones themselves possess some form of awareness, a claim that led several members to question the gentleman's soundness of mind. The connection between this Thomas Oatman and Thomas Oatman remains speculative, though the similarities are suggestive. What is certain is that the violent events at the remote Montana cabin left one woman dead and forever changed the life of another. In 1968, exactly 100 years after the Oatman incident, Sarah's journal was re-examined by Dr. Margaret Whiting, an anthropologist specializing in frontier settlements. Her analysis, published in the American Journal of Historical Anthropology, noted several passages that had been previously overlooked or misinterpreted. Of particular interest were Sarah's descriptions of her father's behavior in the weeks preceding the fatal confrontation. Upon closer examination, Dr. Whiting wrote, Sarah's account suggests a pattern consistent with what modern psychology would identify as acute paranoid ideation, possibly triggered by extended isolation combined with some catalyzing discovery. Thomas Oatman's fixation on the objects from the mine shaft, his increasing vigilance, and his efforts to prevent his family from leaving all point to a man in the grip of delusional thinking. Dr. Whiting also highlighted a passage where Sarah described her father covering the cabin windows with hides and insisting they maintain no fire at night, so they won't see our light. This behavior, combined with his reported mutterings about what lives in the deep places and watchers in the woods, painted a picture of a man suffering from severe psychological deterioration. What remains unexplained in Dr. Whiting's analysis is what exactly triggered Thomas Oatman's descent into paranoia. The abandoned mine shaft, according to territorial records from 1865, had previously belonged to a small silver mining operation that went bankrupt after less than a year of operation. The official reason given was insufficient yield, but correspondence between the mine's owner, Franklin Mercer, and his investors, preserved in the Montana State University archives, hinted at other concerns. In one letter dated October 1865, Mercer wrote, "The men refuse to continue work below the third level. They speak of unnatural sounds and claim the rock itself seems to shift when not observed directly. I have lost 6 workers in the past month alone, all departing without collecting their wages. While I attribute this to simple superstition, the practical effect is the same. Operations cannot continue under these circumstances." Another letter, dated November 2, 1865, elaborates, "Foreman Williams reports discovery of an unusual stratum at the lowest excavated point. The rock is described as different in both color and texture from surrounding formations, with embedded materials that Williams claims are not natural to the region. I have instructed him to extract samples for expert examination, though I confess the men's reluctance to approach this area makes progress exceedingly slow." The final letter in the sequence, dated December 17, 1865, takes a more urgent tone. "I must regretfully announce the complete suspension of operations following yesterday's incident. During extraction of specimens from the anomalous stratum, a partial collapse occurred, trapping Williams and 2 others for several hours. Upon rescue, all 3 men were found in a state of extreme agitation, claiming to have heard voices in the darkness unlike any human or animal sound. Williams, previously the most rational of men, now refuses to re-enter the mine under any circumstances. Given the men's condition and the approaching winter, I have no choice but to seal the operation until spring, at which time I will reassess whether continued investment is warranted." No further correspondence exists, and county records indicate Mercer sold his claim the following year to an anonymous buyer, potentially Thomas Oatman, though this connection has never been definitively established. The mine was subsequently abandoned, its entrances reportedly sealed with dynamite in early 1866, just months before the Oatman family established their homestead in the vicinity. Another aspect of the case that received renewed attention in the mid-20th century was the fate of the Blackfoot family who allegedly sheltered Sarah Oatman after her escape. Dr. Robert Landry, a historian specializing in Native American settler relations, conducted extensive research among Blackfoot oral histories during the 1950s. His findings, published in the Journal of Indigenous Studies in 1957, identified a family that may have corresponded to Sarah's account. According to these oral traditions, a Blackfoot hunter named Mountain Horse and his family took in a woman from the eastern lands during the winter of 1868. The woman reportedly arrived on horseback in a state of extreme exhaustion and initially could not speak due to what was described as a terror that had frozen her voice. She remained with the family until spring, gradually recovering and sharing a story about a man who had found something in the earth that should have remained buried. Dr. Tree. Landry's interview notes, preserved at the University of Montana archives, contain the testimony of Samuel Running Deer, a grandson of Mountain Horse. "My grandfather told me the woman came in the moon of long nights, approximately January-February, when the snow was deepest. She had traveled far without proper provisions and was close to freezing when they found her near their winter camp. For many days she would wake screaming from dreams, speaking of watching stones and a man possessed by them. My grandfather believed evil spirits had attached themselves to her family, though the woman insisted what her father had found was physical, not spiritual. Things made by hands not human or animal, but something else? Most intriguing was the description of the woman's departure. According to Mountain Horse's grandson, interviewed by Landry in 1955, the family had been warned by the woman to relocate their camp away from the shadow of a particular mountain where her father had made his discovery. The family, respecting her fear, moved their winter camp several miles east. The woman departed for a northern mission in spring, but not before leaving them with a small leather pouch containing what was described as a stone, marked with signs no human hand had made. This pouch was reportedly kept as a curiosity for several generations before being traded to a fur trapper in the 1890s. Its subsequent whereabouts remain unknown, though Landry's research suggested it may have eventually found its way to a private collection in Seattle that was dispersed following its owner's death in 1917. The abandoned mine shaft itself became the subject of several expeditions in the early 20th century, though none succeeded in locating its precise position. A 1922 geological survey conducted by the University of Montana identified several collapsed mine entrances in the general vicinity, but noted that extensive erosion and forest growth had obscured most evidence of 19th century mining activities. Professor William Harrison, who led the survey, wrote in his field notes, "The region contains numerous abandoned mining attempts, most dating to the silver and copper prospecting boom of the 1860s. Of particular interest is Site 37B, where we observed an unusual formation not consistent with typical mining closures. The entrance appears to have been sealed not once, but repeatedly over time, with the most recent effort dating to perhaps 20 to 30 years ago, suggesting someone considered it important to ensure the shaft remained inaccessible." One expedition, led by amateur archaeologist Victor Stanfield in 1935, claimed to have discovered an entrance matching descriptions from the Oatman case records. Many were hastily abandoned and inadequately sealed, resulting in dangerous conditions for current exploration. Stanfield's journal, now in the possession of the Montana Historical Society, describes descending approximately 40 feet into a narrow shaft before encountering a chamber where the walls bore unusual markings, seemingly deliberate yet conforming to no known system of writing or decoration. Stanfield wrote, "The patterns appear to have been incised into the living rock rather than painted or applied. Most striking is the consistency of execution. Each circle is geometrically perfect to a degree that would be difficult to achieve with primitive tools, yet the age of the markings, as evidenced by mineral deposits partially obscuring them, suggests considerable antiquity." Photographs taken by Stanfield show what appear to be geometric patterns in the rock face, though subsequent analysis by geologists suggested these were likely natural formations resulting from mineral deposits along stress fractures in the stone. They consist primarily of concentric circles arranged in groups of 7, with lines radiating between these groupings in a manner suggesting intentional organization rather than random decoration. Dr. Harold Winters of the U.S. Geological Survey examined the photographs in 1947 and concluded, while unusual in appearance, the patterns documented by Stanfield represent a known phenomenon wherein crystalline structures form along fault lines in certain mineral-rich environments. The apparent regularity is a product of natural crystallographic principles rather than artificial intervention. Not all experts agreed with this assessment. Dr. Catherine Bowles, an archaeologist who reviewed Stanfield's materials in 1952, noted, "While I hesitate to contradict geological expertise, certain aspects of these patterns resist explanation through known natural processes. The consistent sevenfold symmetry in particular represents a statistical anomaly if attributed solely to random crystallization. Without examining the site firsthand, definitive conclusions are impossible. But the possibility of artificial origin deserves serious consideration." Stanfield's expedition was cut short when 2 members of his team reportedly experienced severe disorientation and panic, necessitating a rapid ascent. His journal entries become increasingly disjointed after this incident, with references to sounds that seem to emanate from the stone itself, and the distinct sensation of being observed from all directions simultaneously. Stanfield abandoned further exploration and reportedly suffered from insomnia and paranoia for several months afterward. By 1936, he had relocated to California, refusing to discuss the expedition further. His final journal entry regarding the expedition reads, "I have burned my maps and notes regarding the precise location. Some doors should remain closed. I find myself constantly checking over my shoulder, convinced that something followed us from that darkness. The specimens I collected have been sealed in lead and buried where no one will find them. I warn any who might read this. The Oatman mine should remain lost to history." The historical record provides no definitive explanation for what Thomas Oatman discovered in that abandoned mine shaft, or whether his deteriorating mental state caused him to attribute significance to ordinary geological specimens. What seems clear is that something, whether external or internal, triggered a profound psychological change in a man previously described by Pennsylvania acquaintances as methodical, reserved, and not given to flights of fancy. Eleanor Oatman's sister, Harriet Wilcox, provided perhaps the most insightful character assessment of Thomas in an 1880 letter to Marshall Blackwood, discovered in his personal papers after his death. She wrote, "My brother-in-law was not a man of imagination or superstition. If anything, he was excessively rational, dismissive of anything that could not be measured or quantified. He kept meticulous ledgers of household expenses and business transactions, planning each venture with careful calculation of risk and reward. When they departed for Montana, he carried 3 separate maps and had researched every aspect of the journey. This systematic, analytical approach defined his character," she continued. "What troubles me most about the accounts I have heard is the fundamental change in his nature. Thomas would never have abandoned his business plans on a whim or fancy. He was not prone to seeing patterns where none existed or attributing mystical significance to natural phenomena. Whatever transformed him in those mountains must have presented itself in terms he could not rationalize away. This, more than anything, disturbs my thoughts when I consider Eleanor's fate." This portrait of Thomas as a rationalist makes his descent into paranoia all the more puzzling. Dr. James Finch, a psychiatrist who reviewed the case records in 1963 for a study on frontier isolation and mental health, noted that acute psychosis typically manifests in individuals with pre-existing vulnerabilities. "Nothing in Thomas Oatman's history suggests such vulnerability," Dr. Finch wrote. His military service was unremarkable, with no recorded incidents of unusual behavior. His business dealings in Pennsylvania were characterized by straightforward pragmatism. The transformation described by his daughter suggests either an extraordinary psychological break or some genuine external catalyst. Dr. Finch's analysis continues. "Frontier isolation certainly exacerbated whatever process was underway, removing the stabilizing influence of community and routine. However, the specific nature of Thomas's delusions, centered around objects with supposed ancient origins and the belief that these objects were somehow sentient or connected to watching entities, represents an unusual constellation of symptoms not typically seen in cases of simple environmental stress or inherited psychiatric conditions. The Oatman cabin site itself developed a reputation among local residents in the decades following the incident. Forest Service records from the early 1900s note that trappers and hunters tended to avoid the area, reporting unusual acoustics and disorienting sensations when camping nearby. A forest ranger named Howard Mitchell wrote in his 1919 logbook, "Local guides refuse to approach the old Oatman place after sunset. They speak of time seeming to stretch or compress, and of watches stopping or running backward. I attribute this to the natural human tendency to attach supernatural significance to sites associated with tragedy, yet I must confess a certain unease when duty requires me to patrol the vicinity." Mitchell's entry from August 12, 1919, describes one such patrol. Conducted routine fire prevention inspection of the northern quadrant today, including the valley where the Oatman cabin reportedly stood. Though I have visited this location at least a dozen times without incident, today I experienced a peculiar phenomenon. My compass began spinning erratically when I approached the clearing where foundation stones are still visible. More disconcerting was the silence. Not merely quiet, but a complete absence of sound. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees, though I could see branches moving. The sensation lasted approximately 10 minutes before abruptly ending, as if a door had opened. I found myself checking my watch repeatedly afterward, as time seemed to pass at an inconsistent rate. The area was eventually incorporated into national forest land, with the exact location of the cabin site lost to time and forest reclamation. Occasional hikers and campers in the general vicinity have reported unusual experiences over the decades: compasses behaving erratically, unexplained temperature fluctuations, and a persistent sensation described by one 1950s backpacker as the feeling of standing in a room where a conversation has just stopped because you entered. In 1959, a forest fire swept through portions of the region, revealing what appeared to be the remnants of building foundations and a filled-in shaft. Entrance approximately 3 miles apart, potentially corresponding to the Oatman cabin and the mine Thomas had explored. His report noted that metal detection equipment behaved unpredictably in the vicinity of the shaft entrance, alternating between silence and readings that suggested massive metal deposits where geology indicated none should exist. Cranston's field notes, preserved in Forest Service archives, provide additional detail. The foundation appears consistent with descriptions of the Oatman cabin, approximately 20 feet by 16 feet, with a smaller attached structure that may have been Thomas's workshop. Forest Service employee David Cranston photographed these discoveries before they were once again reclaimed by vegetation. Scattered artifacts include corroded metal hinges, a partial horseshoe, and fragments of blue and white porcelain that matched descriptions of Eleanor Oatman's prized china set brought from Pennsylvania. Most notable was the discovery of a small metal container, severely damaged by fire and time, containing what appears to be fine rock dust and several small fragments of an unidentified crystalline material. A subsequent investigation by the U.S. Geological Survey in early 1960 found nothing unusual about the site, though their report acknowledged that the area had been significantly disturbed by both the fire and earlier explorations. The crystalline fragments were identified as quartz with trace mineral inclusions, likely of natural origin. The matter was ultimately dismissed as equipment malfunction, and no further official investigations were conducted. Sarah Thurmond, formerly Oatman, remained reticent about certain aspects of her experience throughout her life. In an 1890 letter to her Pennsylvania Aunt Harriet, she wrote, "There are things about that winter I have never shared, not with the authorities, not with my husband, not with anyone. Some memories are best left undisturbed, like those rocks Father brought from the darkness. I still dream of them sometimes, the patterns that seem to shift when not directly observed, the way they felt unnaturally warm, even in the deepest cold of winter. Whatever Father found in that place, I am convinced it would have been better left buried." She continued, "I have built a good life here in San Francisco. William is a kind husband. Our home is comfortable, and I have found peace in my gardening and church activities. Yet there are nights when I wake convinced I hear the same sounds that emanated from Father's specimens, a subtle vibration just beyond the threshold of hearing, a resonance that seems to bypass the ears and speak directly to the mind. On these occasions, I find myself checking our windows and doors, ensuring that nothing can see in, just as Father once did." This letter, preserved in the Wilcox family papers and donated to the University of Pennsylvania archives in 1943, represents one of the few instances where Sarah provided specific details about the specimens themselves. The description of patterns that shifted when not directly observed parallels comments made by the miners who abandoned the shaft in 1865. suggesting some consistency in how different individuals perceived these objects. Dr. Catherine Marlowe, a geologist who reviewed the historical accounts in 1968, proposed several scientific explanations for the phenomena described. Certain mineral formations, particularly those containing trace amounts of radioactive elements, can produce visual effects that might appear as shifting patterns due to their interaction with human vision, she wrote in Geological Quarterly. Similarly, phosphorescent minerals can retain and release heat in ways that might seem unusual to individuals unfamiliar with their properties. She further noted, the reports of sounds associated with these specimens could potentially be explained by piezoelectric properties found in certain crystals, which generate electrical charges under pressure. The consistent reports of circular or seven-fold patterns might reflect crystalline structures common to specific mineral formations in the region. While such explanations might account for the physical properties Sarah described, they do little to explain the profound psychological impact these objects apparently had on Thomas Oatman, or why miners abandoned a potentially profitable operation while forfeiting their wages, or why Stanfield's exploration team experienced such extreme reactions in 1935. In confined spaces such as mines, natural pressure variations might produce subtle electrical discharges that could be perceived as sounds or vibrations by sensitive individuals. A more esoteric interpretation was offered by Professor Alan Weymouth of Missoula College in his controversial 1965 book, Anomalous Encounters: Unexplained Phenomena in American Frontier History. Weymouth suggested that certain geological formations might function as what he termed psychoreactive materials, substances that, through mechanisms unknown to contemporary science, could amplify or externalize human thought patterns. In this framework, he wrote, what Thomas Oatman encountered might have been less a discrete discovery than a mirror reflecting and magnifying his own psychological state, particularly the isolation and alienation he experienced in the wilderness. Weymouth expanded on this theory. The consistent reports of feeling watched or observed could represent the externalization of the subject's own self-awareness, projected outward and experienced as a separate entity. The more attention Thomas focused on the specimens, the more his own consciousness was reflected back at him in distorted form, creating a feedback loop of increasing paranoia and dissociation from reality. Weymouth's theory, while dismissed by mainstream academia, gained a following among those interested in fringe science and psychology. It offered an explanation that bridged the gap between purely psychological and purely external interpretations of the Oatman incident, suggesting that something real was discovered, but its effects were shaped by the discoverer's mental state. Whatever the truth, the story of the Oatman family cabin and what happened there in February 1868 remains one of the most disturbing and enigmatic cases in frontier history. It combines elements of domestic tragedy, psychological horror, and unexplained phenomena in ways that continue to resist definitive explanation more than a century later. In her final years, Sarah Oatman Thurmond rarely spoke of her early life in Montana. Her neighbors in San Francisco knew her as a quiet, somewhat reserved woman who occasionally taught piano to neighborhood children. According to her obituary published in the San Francisco Chronicle on April 3, 1921, she was remembered primarily for her charitable work with the local church and her extensive garden, which specialized in plants that thrived in shade and darkness. One detail from this obituary stands out. Sarah reportedly maintained a peculiar habit throughout her adult life. Each night before retiring, she would check every window in her home, ensuring not only that they were locked, but that the curtains were tightly drawn. When asked about this practice by a friend, she allegedly responded, "Some things shouldn't be seen, and some things shouldn't see in." William Thurmond, interviewed briefly after his wife's death, mentioned that Sarah maintained one strict household rule throughout their marriage. No stones or mineral specimens were permitted in their home under any circumstances. She would not even allow decorative agates or quartz crystals that were popular in many households, he stated. If gifted such items, she would politely thank the giver, then dispose of them immediately. She never explained this aversion beyond saying that some things carry memories best left undisturbed. The Oatman case exemplifies how frontier isolation could transform ordinary individuals in extraordinary ways. The vast, untamed landscapes of the American West tested not just physical endurance, but psychological resilience. For every successful pioneer who adapted to these challenges, there were others who encountered boundaries within themselves or in the natural world that proved insurmountable. Thomas Oatman, by all accounts, began his Western journey as a practical man seeking economic opportunity. What he may have found instead was something that defied his understanding of reality, whether a genuine anomaly or the manifestation of his own deteriorating mental state. The consequences of this encounter rippled outward, claiming Eleanor's life and permanently altering Sarah's future. In 1964, a professor of American history named Martin Campbell published an article titled "Shadows in the Wilderness: Unexplained Disappearances in the American West, 1840–1880." The piece examined several cases similar to the Oatman incident, situations where isolated settlers exhibited sudden personality changes followed by violence or disappearances. Campbell identified 17 such cases across the Western Territories, noting that many shared certain elements: proximity to abandoned mining operations, reports of unusual geological discoveries, and patterns of escalating paranoia centered around fears of being watched or found. While conventional historical analysis might attribute these patterns to the psychological stresses of frontier life, Campbell wrote, the consistency of certain elements across widely separated incidents suggests the possibility of some common external factor, perhaps environmental, perhaps geological, that interacted with human psychology in unpredictable ways. Campbell's research included the case of the Donner family in Colorado, no relation to the infamous Donner Party, who in 1872 abandoned a prosperous homestead after the father became convinced that something in the western ridge was watching the house. The family reported that Jacob Donner had discovered unusual stones with moving patterns while digging a new well. His behavior reportedly changed dramatically over the course of several weeks, culminating in an attempt to seal their cabin completely from outside view before his wife fled with their children. Similar incidents occurred in Wyoming Territory, 1858, Northern California, 1863, and Eastern Nevada, 1875. In each case, Campbell documented a strikingly similar progression: discovery of unusual geological specimens, increasing paranoia centered around being watched or observed, attempts to seal or conceal living spaces, and ultimately, violence or disappearance. These cases represent an unexamined subset of frontier history, Campbell concluded. Neither conventional historical approaches nor pure psychological analysis seem adequate to explain the remarkable consistency across disparate incidents separated by significant time and distance. Whatever these individuals encountered, whether external reality or shared delusion, deserves more serious scholarly attention than it has received. Campbell's research was largely forgotten until the early 21st century, when digital archiving made his work more accessible to researchers. Modern historians generally view his conclusions skeptically, preferring explanations grounded in the known psychological effects of isolation, combined with the physical hardships of frontier life. Yet his catalog of cases remains a compelling document, highlighting how much of frontier history remains obscured by time, distance, and the limitations of 19th century record-keeping. The mine shaft that so profoundly affected Thomas Oatman likely still exists in some form, buried beneath decades of erosion and forest growth in the mountains of northern Montana. The cabin site has returned to wilderness, its exact location disputed among local historians. The specimens Thomas collected were lost in the San Francisco earthquake, their nature remaining a subject of speculation. What survives is the human element of the story, the documented transformation of a rational man into someone capable of violence against his own family, the courage of a young woman who fled into a winter wilderness rather than remain in an increasingly dangerous home, and the way these events echoed through the lives of all who encountered them. In 1968, on the centennial of the incident, the Montana Historical Society organized a small exhibition on the Oatman case, displaying Sarah's journal alongside photographs of the region and the few artifacts recovered from the cabin site. According to the curator's notes, one item attracted particular attention: a small iron box, severely corroded, discovered during the 1959 forest fire and believed to have belonged to the Oatman household. The box, approximately 6 inches square, had been sealed shut by rust and corrosion. After careful consideration, conservators decided to open it to preserve any contents that might be deteriorating inside. The procedure, documented in conservation records, revealed something unexpected. The box was empty except for a folded piece of paper bearing a single line of text in what was identified as Thomas Oatman's handwriting, based on comparison with his military service records and business correspondence from Pennsylvania. The message, preserved now in the Montana Historical Society archives, reads simply, "They are watching. They have always been watching." Dr. Sukris. Elizabeth Hartwell, who supervised the conservation effort, noted in her report, "The paper appears to have been torn from a larger document, possibly a journal or ledger. The ink shows minimal fading, suggesting the box provided excellent protection from light and moisture." Most curious is the apparent state of mind evident in the penmanship, the normally meticulous handwriting of Mr. Oatman, as evidenced by his other documents, here shows signs of extreme agitation, with irregular pressure and trembling evident in the formation of certain letters. The message was written by someone in a state of significant distress. Whether these words represented the delusions of a mind unraveled by isolation or something more remains, like so much of the Oatman case, a matter of interpretation. What is certain is that something happened in those remote mountains in the winter of 1868, something that transformed a family, ended a life, and left behind questions that continue to resist definitive answers. The Oatman cabin, the mine shaft, the specimens Thomas collected, all physical traces have vanished with time. What remains is a story that continues to disturb, not for any supernatural elements, but for what it suggests about the fragility of the human mind when confronted with isolation, darkness, and perhaps something that defies rational explanation. As Dr. Whiting concluded in her 1968 analysis, the true horror of the Oatman case lies not in what we know, but in what remains unknown, the spaces between documented facts where certainty dissolves and we are left only with questions. What did Thomas find in that abandoned mine? What transformed him from a rational pioneer into someone his own family feared? And perhaps most disturbingly, if Sarah's account is accurate, what became of Thomas and the specimens he carried with him when he vanished from San Francisco in 1877? The mountains of northern Montana keep their secrets well. The old-timers who live in the scattered settlements near the former Oatman property rarely discuss the case, though some still avoid certain valleys and ridgelines, particularly after sunset. Forest rangers occasionally report unusual equipment malfunctions or unexplained sounds in the general vicinity, though such reports are generally dismissed as the result of unusual acoustics or wildlife activity. One such report, filed in 1972 by Ranger Michael Collins, describes an incident during a routine fire patrol. While traversing the ridge approximately 2.5 miles east of Jensen Creek, I experienced a complete failure of both my radio and compass within a span of approximately 10 minutes. The area was unnaturally quiet, with no audible wildlife, despite abundant signs of deer and small mammals in the vicinity. Most disturbing was the sensation that I was being observed from multiple directions simultaneously, though no individuals were visible. The feeling was sufficiently intense that I altered my patrol route to exit the area by the most direct path. Equipment functionality returned to normal approximately 1/2 mile from the affected location. In 1993, a hiker named Joseph Merrick discovered what appeared to be a partial journal page while camping approximately 5 miles from the presumed Oatman cabin site. The paper, yellowed and brittle with age, contained handwritten text consistent with 19th century penmanship. Though much of the writing was illegible due to water damage, several phrases remained clear. "The patterns move when I sleep. Eleanor says they're just rocks. And most distinctly, they want to be found." Merrick's account of the discovery, recorded in an interview with local historian Thomas Bradbury, included an unusual detail. The paper wasn't just lying on the ground or in a crevice. It was perfectly preserved inside a small metal container that had been carefully placed beneath a distinctive rock formation. 3 stones balanced in a way that couldn't possibly be natural. I never would have found it if my dog hadn't become fixated on that spot, refusing to move until I investigated. The strangest part was how the paper affected my dreams that night. I dreamt of perfect circles arranging themselves in patterns, and woke several times convinced someone was standing just outside my tent, watching. Merrick turned the fragment over to the Montana Historical Society, where analysis confirmed its age but could not definitively link it to Thomas Oatman. The paper now resides in their archives, cataloged simply as Unidentified Frontier Journal Fragment C, 1860 to 1870. The story of the Oatman family and their remote cabin continues to resonate because it represents a particular kind of frontier experience, not the triumphant narrative of conquest and opportunity that dominates popular conceptions of westward expansion, but the darker reality of isolation, psychological fragility, and the vast unknowns that settlers faced as they ventured into territories barely mapped and little understood. In those remote cabins, far from the structures of civilization, individuals confronted not just external challenges, but the uncharted territories within themselves. Some emerged strengthened. Others, like Thomas Oatman, encountered boundaries they could not cross without fundamental transformation or disintegration. Sarah Oatman survived her ordeal and built a new life for herself, though her writings suggest she never entirely escaped the shadow of what happened in that Montana cabin. Her story represents resilience in the face of both external danger and the collapse of the family unit that should have provided safety and stability. The ultimate fate of Thomas Oatman remains unknown. If the reports from Australia and later the Marquesas Islands are to be credited, he spent his remaining years searching for validation of whatever he believed he had discovered, moving ever further from civilization, perhaps still carrying specimens from that abandoned mine shaft, still hoping someone would recognize their significance. In this sense, the Oatman case transcends its specific historical context to become something more universal, a story about the human need to make sense of the incomprehensible and what happens when that effort fails. Thomas Oatman encountered something he could not integrate into his understanding of reality. The result was psychological disintegration and violence. Dr. Harriet Fenton, a psychiatrist who reviewed the case in 1997, wrote, "From a modern clinical perspective, Thomas Oatman's progression suggests a form of delusional disorder potentially triggered by the combination of environmental isolation and some catalyzing discovery. The specific nature of his delusions, centered around objects with supposed ancient significance and the belief that these objects were somehow watching or communicating, represents an unusual presentation that doesn't neatly fit established diagnostic categories," she continued. Most intriguing is the apparent contagious aspect of the phenomenon, where multiple individuals who came in contact with the specimens or the mine site reported similar perceptual experiences. This suggests either a shared psychological response to suggestion, a form of folie à deux extended beyond a single relationship, or potentially some environmental factor capable of influencing perception and cognition. Without the opportunity to examine either the geological specimens or the mine location directly, definitive clinical assessment remains impossible. The remote cabin where these events unfolded has long since returned to wilderness, its exact location lost to time. The mine shaft that may have triggered Thomas's transformation remains unexplored, its entrance collapsed or concealed by a century and a half of natural processes. The specimens he collected were lost in the San Francisco earthquake, their nature a matter of speculation and conflicting accounts. What remains is the story itself, preserved in fragmentary records, journals, and testimonies. It continues to disturb not because it offers conclusive evidence of anything supernatural or paranormal, but because it occupies an ambiguous territory between known psychological phenomena and the suggestion of something beyond conventional understanding. In this ambiguity lies the enduring power of the Oatman case. It resists definitive explanation. It raises questions about the nature of reality, perception, and the human mind that remain relevant today. It reminds us that the frontier was not merely a physical space to be conquered, but a psychological boundary to be negotiated, sometimes successfully, sometimes at terrible cost. The mountains where the Oatman family briefly settled still stand, impassive and ancient. Whatever secrets they may hold remain buried in darkness, perhaps better left undisturbed. For as Sarah Oatman wrote in her final letter to her Aunt Harriet, some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. And perhaps that is the true lesson of the Oatman tragedy, that in our quest to understand the world around us, to categorize and control it, we occasionally encounter phenomena that resist our efforts at rationalization. In those moments, we face a choice: to acknowledge the limits of our understanding and retreat, or to press forward into territories where certainty dissolves and the foundations of reality itself may be called into question. Thomas Oatman made his choice in the winter of 1868. The consequences echo through time, preserved in fragments of testimony and journal pages, in the scattered artifacts of a frontier tragedy, and in the whispered stories that still circulate among those who live in the shadow of those remote mountains. The truth, whatever it may be, remains buried in a collapsed mine shaft, in lost specimens, in the memories of a woman long dead, and in the unknown fate of a man who vanished into the Pacific, carrying his discoveries and his secrets with him. And perhaps, in the end, that uncertainty is the most disturbing aspect of the entire case, the suggestion that just beyond the boundaries of our understanding, something waits, watching, as it has always watched.